Some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Some disappearances are so complete, so inexplicable, that they become the stuff of legend rather than investigation. But sometimes, after more than a decade of silence, the desert gives up its secrets in ways that no one could have predicted. What I'm about to tell you is the true story of the Hartwell family disappearance, a case that baffled investigators for 11 years until one man's determination to find answers led to a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about what happened in the Mojave Desert in October 2013. It started as the perfect family camping trip. Mark Hartwell, 42, was a mechanical engineer who worked for an aerospace company in Los Angeles. His wife Jennifer, 39, was a high school biology teacher with a passion for nature photography. Their two children, 16-year-old Jake and 13-year-old Lily, were typical teenagers who had been dragged on enough family camping trips to actually start enjoying them. The Hartwells were experienced campers. They'd been taking annual trips to Joshua Tree, Death Valley, and various spots throughout the Mojave Desert for over a decade. Mark knew how to navigate by stars and compass, Jennifer was trained in wilderness first aid, and both kids had been taught basic survival skills from a young age. On October 12, 2013, they loaded up their silver 2011 Ford F-150 pickup truck with camping gear, enough food and water for a week, and set out for what they called their annual desert adventure. Their destination was a remote camping area near the Kelso Dunes, about 3 hours east of Los Angeles in the heart of the Mojave National Preserve. "We'll be back by Sunday," Mark told his brother Tom as they said goodbye. "Call the Rangers if you don't hear from us by Monday night." It was the last conversation anyone would have with the Hartwell family for 11 years. When Monday came and went with no word, Tom called the Mojave National Preserve Rangers as promised. A search was launched immediately. The Hartwells were known to be responsible campers who always stuck to their planned itinerary and check-in times. The initial search focused on the Kelso Dunes area and the surrounding desert. Rangers found their planned campsite, a fire ring showed evidence of recent use, and tire tracks matching their truck were found in the sand. But the Hartwells themselves, and their truck, had vanished without a trace. Over the next 2 weeks, the search expanded to cover over 500 square miles of desert. Helicopters scanned from above, search and rescue teams combed the ground on foot and horseback, and volunteers from across Southern California joined the effort. They found nothing. No vehicle. No bodies. No clothing. No camping equipment. It was as if the family of 4 had simply evaporated into the desert air. The investigation that followed turned up few clues. The Hartwells' cell phones had last pinged towers near Barstow on their way to the camping area, exactly where they would have been expected to be. Their bank accounts showed no unusual activity after October 12. There were no signs of financial problems, marital issues, or any reason the family might have wanted to disappear voluntarily. Mark's truck had a GPS system, but it wasn't the kind that could be tracked remotely. Credit card records showed they'd stopped for gas in Barstow and bought supplies at a camping store, exactly as planned. Security footage from the gas station showed a happy family loading up for what looked like a routine camping trip. As months turned to years, the case grew cold. The official investigation was scaled back, though it was never officially closed. The Hartwell disappearance became one of those unsolved mysteries that haunt desert communities, a reminder that the Mojave could swallow people whole and never give them back. Tom Hartwell never stopped looking for his brother's family. As Jake would have grown older, Tom often wondered what kind of man his nephew would have become. He organized private search efforts, hired investigators, and spent his weekends driving desert back roads, always hoping to find some trace of the silver F-150. But it was Jake himself who would eventually provide the answers Tom had been searching for. Because Jake Hartwell hadn't died in the desert in October 2013. He'd survived, and he'd been looking for his family just as desperately as his uncle had been looking for him. The truth began to unravel on a scorching hot day in July 2024, when 27-year-old Jake Hartwell was working as a search and rescue volunteer in a completely different part of the Mojave Desert, nearly 200 miles from where his family had originally planned to camp. Jake had no memory of his original last name or his life before the age of 16. He'd been found wandering near a truck stop outside of Needles, California, in November 2013, severely dehydrated and suffering from what doctors determined was traumatic amnesia. With no identification and no missing person reports that matched his description, he'd been placed in the foster care system and eventually aged out at 18. The name Jake was all he could remember about himself. Social workers had given him the last name Morrison, a placeholder that had stuck. He'd grown up knowing that somewhere in his missing memories was a family he couldn't remember, a life he'd lost access to. What drew him to search and rescue work was an inexplicable pull toward the desert. He felt most at home in the vast, empty spaces of the Mojave, and he had an almost supernatural ability to navigate terrain that baffled other searchers. It was as if the desert spoke to him in a language he understood but couldn't quite translate. On that July day in 2024, Jake was part of a team searching for a missing hiker near the Providence Mountains. He'd separated from the main group to check a remote canyon when something caught his eye, a glint of metal reflecting sunlight from a wash that was almost completely hidden by decades of sand and debris. Jake scrambled down into the wash and began digging with his hands. What he uncovered made his heart stop. It was the corner of a license plate. California plates. As he dug further, more of the plate became visible, and then he could see numbers and letters, 7G49B52. Jake photographed the plate and immediately called it in to his team leader. Within hours, a full excavation team was on scene. What they found buried in the sand defied explanation. It was a silver 2011 Ford F-150 pickup truck, buried so deeply and completely that it had taken 11 years of flash floods and shifting sand to reveal even a corner of the license plate. But this wasn't just any truck. The license plate number matched the vehicle that the Hartwell family had been driving when they disappeared. As the excavation continued over the next 2 days, the mystery only deepened. The truck was found nearly 200 miles from the Kelso Dunes area where the family had planned to camp. Even stranger, it was buried in a location that would have been almost impossible to reach in a standard pickup truck, a narrow canyon accessible only by foot or specialized off-road vehicles. Inside the truck, investigators found camping equipment, personal belongings, and clear evidence that the Hartwell family had been there. Jennifer Hartwell's camera was recovered with dozens of photos from their camping trip, images that showed them setting up camp, cooking meals, and exploring the desert, all looking happy and relaxed. But there were no human remains. The photos on Jennifer's camera told a story that investigators had never imagined. The Hartwells hadn't disappeared from their planned campsite at Kelso Dunes. They'd made it there safely, camped for several days exactly as planned, and then had apparently decided to explore areas far beyond their original itinerary. The final photos on the camera showed the family hiking in terrain that looked nothing like the Kelso Dunes area. Rugged canyon walls, strange rock formations, and in the background of several shots, the distinctive silhouette of the Providence Mountains, exactly where Jake had found the truck. But how had the family traveled 200 miles from their original campsite? And how had their truck ended up buried in a nearly inaccessible canyon? As investigators studied the photos more closely, they noticed something else. In several of the final images, there appeared to be other people in the background, shadowy figures that were too far away to identify clearly. Jake stared at these photos with a growing sense of unease that he couldn't explain. The faces in the pictures looked familiar, but he couldn't place them. The terrain looked like somewhere he'd been before, but he had no memory of when or why. And then he saw the final photo on Jennifer's camera. It showed a teenage boy who looked exactly like Jake had looked when he was found wandering near Needles. The boy was standing next to a man who could have been Jake's older brother, both of them squinting into desert sunlight, both of them smiling. Jake's hands began to shake as he stared at the photo. The face looking back at him was his own face, 11 years younger, but unmistakably his. "That's me," he whispered to the investigator sitting next to him. "That's me in the photo." The revelation that Jake Morrison was actually Jake Hartwell, the missing son who had been presumed dead for over a decade, sent shockwaves through the investigation. DNA tests confirmed what the photographs had suggested. Jake was indeed the 16-year-old boy who had vanished with his family in October 2013. But confirming Jake's identity only deepened the mystery. If Jake had survived, where were his parents and sister? How had he ended up 50 miles away from where the truck was found? And why couldn't he remember anything about what had happened? Working with psychiatrists who specialized in trauma-induced amnesia, Jake began the slow process of trying to recover his lost memories. The process was triggered by returning to the canyon where the truck had been found. Standing in the exact spot where the final photos had been taken, Jake felt something shift in his mind. Fragments of memory began to surface, not complete scenes, but flashes of images and sensations. He remembered hiking. He remembered his father saying they were going to explore, just a little further. He remembered his mother taking pictures of unusual rock formations. He remembered Lily complaining that her feet hurt and asking when they could go back to camp. And then he remembered the sound. It was a rumbling, like thunder, but it came from below rather than above. The ground had shaken, and there had been dust everywhere, and then nothing. The memory stopped there, as if someone had turned off a television in the middle of a program. Geologists called in to examine the site found evidence of significant seismic activity in the area. The Mojave Desert is crisscrossed with fault lines, many of them unmapped and unstable. It appeared that the canyon where the truck was found had experienced a major rockslide sometime in the past decade, possibly triggered by an earthquake. The working theory that emerged was both tragic and remarkable. The Hartwell family had been exploring the canyon when seismic activity had triggered a massive rockslide. The truck had been buried instantly, along with anyone who had been near it at the time. But Jake, for reasons that would probably never be fully understood, had been elsewhere when the slide occurred. Perhaps he'd wandered off to explore on his own, or had been collecting firewood, or had simply been in the right place at the right time to avoid the disaster that had claimed his family. The trauma of witnessing the event, combined with days of wandering the desert alone before being found, had caused his memory to shut down completely. His mind had protected him from the unbearable truth by erasing it entirely. The discovery brought closure to a mystery that had haunted investigators and the Hartwell family for over a decade. Tom Hartwell, now 58 years old, was reunited with the nephew he thought was dead. But the reunion was bittersweet. Jake had no memory of their shared history, and the man Tom embraced was essentially a stranger who happened to share his family's DNA. "I wish I could remember you," Jake told his uncle during their first meeting in 11 years. "I wish I could remember them." "Maybe it's better that you don't," Tom replied, though his voice broke as he said it. "Maybe forgetting was the only way you could survive." The investigation into the Hartwell disappearance was officially closed in September 2024. Mark, Jennifer, and Lily Hartwell were declared dead, victims of a natural disaster that had hidden their fate for over a decade. Their remains were never recovered. The rockslide had been too massive and the terrain too unstable for a full excavation. Jake returned to his work in search and rescue, but with a new understanding of why the desert called to him so strongly. Somewhere in the Mojave, buried beneath tons of rock and sand, were the people who had loved him most in the world. He couldn't remember them, but part of him had never stopped looking for them. "I may not remember my family," Jake said in an interview 6 months after the discovery, "but I remember the feeling of being loved. And I remember the desert. Maybe that's enough." Tom Hartwell established a memorial scholarship in his brother's family's name, funding wilderness safety education for young people. Jake became the program's first spokesman, sharing his story as a reminder of how quickly things can change in the wilderness, and how important it is to be prepared for the unexpected. The silver F-150 was eventually extracted from the canyon and donated to a search and rescue training facility, where it serves as a reminder of both the dangers of the desert and the importance of never giving up hope. But perhaps the most profound impact of the discovery was on Jake himself. Though he never regained his memories of his life before age 16, the knowledge of who he was and where he came from gave him a sense of identity he'd been missing for 11 years. He legally reclaimed his original name, becoming Jake Hartwell once again. He moved closer to his Uncle Tom, and slowly began to build new relationships with the extended family he couldn't remember but who remembered him. "I may not know who I was," he said, "but I know who I am now. And I know that I come from people who loved adventure, who loved each other, and who loved the desert enough to risk everything for it." The Mojave Desert keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, after more than a decade of silence, it reveals them in ways that no one could have predicted. The Hartwell family's story became a reminder that some mysteries take years to solve, that survival can come at the cost of memory, and that sometimes the greatest discovery isn't what you're looking for, it's learning who you've been all along. In the end, Jake Hartwell found his family exactly where they'd always been, not in his memories, which remained locked away, but in the desert itself, in the work he'd chosen to do, and in the inexplicable pull he'd always felt toward the vast, empty spaces where they'd found their final adventure together. The desert had taken his family, but it had also shaped him into the men who would eventually find them. And in that strange, circular way that only the wilderness seems to understand, Jake Hartwell had been searching for his family his entire adult life without ever knowing that's what he was doing. Some people spend their whole lives looking for where they belong. Jake Hartwell discovered that he'd been home all along, not in any specific place, but in the endless search itself, in the patient work of helping others find their way back from places where they thought they were lost forever. Don't forget to like the videos and subscribe to the channel for more short stories.